to what I like to think of as our headiest panel of the day. Couldn't resist the joke. This is the growing, yes, you guys can't hear? Everybody missed my joke. Okay, I'm going to re-say my joke because it was so funny, I thought. So welcome to our headiest panel of the day. There are many more jokes I can make, but I won't. So this panel is the Growing Cannabis Industry panel, and we're really excited to have with us law, policy, and technical experts that are going to talk about cannabis both at the federal level and what's going on within the state of Vermont, and then some issues around production. And our first panelist is Rusty Rumley. Rusty is a staff attorney with the National Ag Law Center. He was born and raised on a family farm in Cogar, is that how you say that? Oklahoma. Graduated magna cum laude from Oklahoma State University with a BS in agribusiness and got his JD from the University of Oklahoma. Rusty presents around the country to producer, consumer, extension, industry, and legal groups on an array of topics, including special use valuation for inherited farmland, right to farm statutes, and the enforcement of animal cruelty statutes by private organizations. So welcome. Thank you, Rusty.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So good mornings for the next 5 minutes. I realize that we're also the panel standing between you guys and lunch, so I will try to move through this as expeditiously as possible. There are a lot of things in the hemp arena right now. We have more questions than we have answers. And every time people get together and talk about it, it seems like we come up with more questions than things that were solved. So a lot of the things I'm afraid we're going to be saying today are we don't know or we're waiting to hear. So we do have a lot of resources on our website. We have all 50 states' regulations. We're currently involved in a project right now. There's a lack of processors out there for hemp growers. So one of the things we're looking at is some states may allow the sale of raw hemp products direct to the consumer. Others don't, but it's extremely tricky to figure out who does what because the rules are kind of all over the place. So that's one project we currently have in the works. So I'm going to touch on the federal issues and then kind of give you guys a big picture of where we're at the current time. We were supposed to get regulations for the 18 Farm Bill. They were originally supposed to come out in August. I actually did a webinar with over 100 people on the new hemp regs last month, and it was kind of interesting because there was no new hemp regs. We also heard rumors that they could be out by the end of October. I seriously doubt that ends up happening. But right now, what we are currently looking at is there's been some logistical problems. And the biggest one that we're going to talk about is the THC testing. There's not a good way of doing it. And there's serious questions on what kind of testing should be done, what's the sampling protocol, how can things be simplified so that law enforcement officers can do these tests on the side of the road. So we got some real issues on that. Crop insurance, issues with pesticides, what can be used on cannabis, what can't be used. There's all kinds of issues that have been coming up under the hemp debate. Right now we have 46 states that have enacted hemp laws. There's still a couple of major ones. Mississippi and Idaho haven't yet. They've been causing problems for other states out there, particularly on the transport side of the issue. We're expecting to see a lot of state laws change here in the immediate future. When the regulations are passed, states are going to have to make sure that their laws, whether it's statutory law or regulatory law, is on point and compliant with the federal law, because you can't submit a plan to grow industrial hemp under the 18 Farm Bill until your state laws are compliant with the regulations that AMS releases. So we're currently waiting for that, and I think a lot of state legislatures or state departments of ag are currently waiting on this. One issue that's come up that people really don't think too much about is the interplay between food and drug law and hemp. So this has been a major sticking point. Even talking to the people in Kentucky, where they've got a robust hemp industry, probably 95% of the acreage is all being grown for CBD production. So when you hear the profitability, the profit margins that you can potentially make from industrial hemp, they're almost always citing towards the CBD production, not so much towards fiber or grain production. So, and one of the things that's been a sticking point on going forward with hemp production is what is CBD and how can it be used? And the current FDA interpretation is that it is a drug and therefore it cannot be included as a food ingredient in it or as a dietary supplement. You can use it in lotions or things like that, but as an active ingredient and a registered drug, you're not allowed to add it to foods or to dietary supplements. Now everyone out there is thinking, that's bull crap because I've seen it. And the answer is you absolutely see it. People are doing it. Just a while back, Carl's Jr. in the middle of Denver started selling CBD infused special sauce on their hamburgers. I mean, it was literally the Mile High Burger. I mean, when major companies are just flat out ignoring FDA, I mean, it kind of gives you a sense of the picture here. I mean, we have what the law says, and then we have what people do, and there's not a whole lot of correlation between the two when it comes to industrial hemp. So it's kind of frustrating for some people, but this has been a reality with the hemp issue, especially with the CBD. Right now, we've got some states that are allowing it, some states are disallowing it and following FDA guidance. Whether or not your state allows it, it's still currently viewed as illegal by the FDA. So when you get into interstate commerce issues, this is going to be a major issue going forward. Initial statements from the FDA said this could take years to resolve. There has been a significant push by Congress to expedite FDA's position. So far, I don't think it's worked too well. So that's kind of where we're at the moment is what's FDA going to do? Currently, they are gathering data, and then we're going to see what the final outcome is. But the future of the CBD usage, this is going to be a major factor on the success of industrial hemp for the country. The other thing I want to mention, I mentioned briefly earlier, is the THC testing. For you law students that are going to be getting out, this is probably going to be an issue for the next couple of years. So this is something that, it's a chance for you guys to make money at. So currently what the thinking is, or the question is are they going to be looking at the total THC in the plants, or are they going to be looking at just the Delta 9 THC? If you read the Farm Bill language closely, it uses the post-decarboxylation, which is usually more commonly referred to as the total THC. So depending upon which definition you want to follow, there's people out there fighting vehemently on what definition should be used. And there's going to be a lot of money at stake depending upon what standard USDA ends up coming out with on the testing requirements. Maybe something that's even more of an issue than the levels themselves is that, and this is more of an anecdotal evidence from talking to people that work in things like crime labs or in the state ag departments in the testing, the offices, the laboratories. They don't. So I'll give you an example. Kentucky sent out 10 of the same sample to some of the different labs across the country. I think they got 9 different results that came back from the tests. I mean, if the state labs are having that much of a difficulty determining what the THC level is, how is this going to be applied when you've got an officer that's pulling over a load of industrial hemp and they're doing a roadside test? So there's going to be some major issues. Sampling protocols, I mean, some of this stuff is very time dependent. So Does your state allow 30 days after sampling to harvest the crop? Does it allow 14 days after the sampling of the crop? Because the longer your crop grows, the higher that level of THC increases. Sample size, who takes the samples, all of this is great procedural fodder for lawyers to fight about out there. So there's going to be a lot of interest in this area going forward for attorneys, if no one else. But right now, there's some states that are just saying, you know, we're kind of giving up on enforcing marijuana laws because we can't honestly tell you the difference between the two. I mean, we can test them, and we can't always tell. I mean, if it's a very high level of THC, I mean, they can generally tell, but if it's something that's a lower quality cannabis product that may be hemp, may not be, there's a lot of money that has to go into making these tests. So that's one of the things that they're pushing for right now is they're advocating for people to start submitting a cheap, easy to administer and highly accurate test to determine what the THC levels are going to be. But no one can really develop those tests until we know how USDA is going to define what THC is. So we're kind of in a holding pattern at the moment. I don't see anything getting done for the 2020 growing season, but after that, you know, this could be a major area going forward. The other issue we're running into is with the transportation. Some states are blessed with a lot of production facilities, processors that are handling the industrial hemp. Other states do not. So there's been a lot of growers that are shipping to states like Colorado because they have a lot of processing capacity there. But you also have to cross states like Mississippi, Oklahoma, other states that are taking a dim view of the hemp crossing state lines. So how does the test that you conduct in Vermont, is that going to be good enough when you travel across New York to get to some other place to process it? And that's, we think that this problem is going to go away after the states start passing their plans under the regulations. But right now, this has been a major issue going forward. So that is, we've also got other issues, the sourcing of seeds, contracts with processors. There's been a lot of statements that, you know, fraud has been happening with dealing with the processors. Either farmers aren't getting paid or they're getting more docked than they should. Pesticide usage has been a big deal. Crop insurance has been a major issue going forward. I mean, there's a lot of questions out there at the federal level at the moment. So it's going to be interesting to see what the other panelists have to say and what they think some of the potential outcomes are.
Thank you, Rusty. Our next panelists are Tim Fair and Andrew Subin. Timothy Fair.
Tim is fine.
Tim is the founder of Vermont's first cannabis law and consulting firm, Vermont Cannabis Solutions. He's been a vocal advocate for both cannabis and overall drug policy reform for most of his adult life, and has been featured on a number of podcasts and radio shows and quoted in multiple national media sources. Andrew Subin has practiced criminal defense with an emphasis on cannabis defense for over 25 years. Throughout his career, he has been a vocal advocate for cannabis law reform. In the early 90s, Mr. Subin was the first attorney in Washington state to employ medical necessity as a defense to the charge of growing marijuana. So thank you and welcome. I don't know which one of you is planning to go. Are you just going to tag team?
Yeah, I guess we'll just, I'll start out.
Hold on, let me set up your...
Hi, everybody. My name is Tim Fair. It was a great introduction. Thank you so much to Laurie. Thank you so much to everybody. So Rusty did a great overview of kind of the issues and the areas that we're looking at in terms of the legality of the hemp industry right now. What I'd like to do, myself and Andrew, is dive a little bit deeper into that, kind of cover some of the areas that you just heard about in a little more detail. But I'd really also like to open up the floor to questions, because one of the things we've found that a lot of people have a lot of interest in this area. And one of the things we do is educate, and that's one of the most important things in this industry is to educate. There's a lot of misinformation out there, there's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of speculation. So after we kind of go a little bit deeper into this, would really like the opportunity to kind of answer some questions and clear anything up for any of the audience members here today. So let's talk a little bit about hemp, CBD, and all these government agencies. So this is one of the biggest misunderstandings people have. We have the USDA, we have the FDA, we have the FTC. Where is all this interplay? Where does this all play into the industry? So 2018 Farm Bill, and if I'm repeating anything that people know, I apologize. I never know where everybody's kind of levels are with this. The 2018 Farm Bill, the Agricultural Improvement Act, is what legalized hemp. It also set a federal definition of 0.3% THC. That is the differential and the current differential between a legal agricultural commodity, hemp, and a controlled substance, Schedule I controlled substance, marijuana, that Delta 9. Rusty was talking a little bit about overall THC, or total theoretical THC. What that is a cannabinoid known as THCA. That's non-psychoactive, that's in the plant. Now, when that process he was talking about, decarboxylation, is not a fancy term for heating it up. And when you heat up the plant, the cannabis plant, that THCA then converts to Delta 9 THC, which is a psychoactive component, which is what everybody uses when they want to get stoned. A plant itself, before that decarb process, actually, if you went ahead and just picked some pot and ate it, contrary to popular belief, not much is going to happen. Not much is going to happen because what you're consuming is THCA, that non-psychoactive component, not the Delta 9, which is a psychoactive component, which gets you stoned. So, huge question is, all right, are we looking at that Delta 9, which is in the plant form, a very, very small amount? Or are we looking at what's going to happen when, theoretically, that THCA converts down to the Delta 9? And this is the testing issue that we're having. This is the testing issue that's causing a lot of problems. Can we go ahead and move forward on a theoretical test of what the conversion rate may be? They got a nice fancy formula for it. They take the THCA, they multiply it by 0.8666, and supposedly that comes out to what the Delta 9 would be after the decarb process. This gets really, really tricky with hemp because the reality is that most hemp strains, when you look at this total theoretical level, are going to be what's known as hot, or they're going to contain over the 0.3 limit that's inscribed now in federal law. On the flip side of this, when you have federal prosecutions for marijuana offenses these days, a lot of times it's in a flower form. They're not arresting you for what's been smoked already. They're arresting you for what's in your possession. And until that has been decarbed, there's plenty of instances where law enforcement will seize a whole bunch of marijuana to test it to find out that, in fact, because it hasn't been decarbed, that Delta 9 is under 0.3, and technically, it's hemp. So this is where they've caused a lot of problems with this testing issue and with the legalities, which is why we have a job. But it is a real true challenge for the CBD industry. It's a true challenge for the hemp industry. Everybody knows CBD. You can buy it now everywhere. Cannabinoid. You can buy it at the gas station. You can buy it at CVD. You can buy it pretty much anywhere. The nasty little secret is that the crude oil that's being extracted to make these CBD products, in 100% of instances, is hot. It's a concentrate. You're concentrating down a whole plant extract. You're extracting out all the cannabinoids in that, the CBD, the THC, the CBN, the CBG. It is literally impossible to do a crude oil extraction, no matter what method you're using, and not have a product that technically is illegal. We kind of look past that, and there are mitigations. You can go ahead and distill that down. You can use ethanol to get that THC out. You can undergo processes. But the reality is that during this process, you are going to have a hot product. So at the current definitions, as it is, we either shut the industry down or there needs to be some modifications made, an allowance. Vermont has done that. Vermont's proposed rules from the Department of Agriculture for our hemp program takes a look at the total theoretical THC, but they allow a margin. They don't hold you tight to that 0.3. They let you up to 1% when you're looking at the total theoretical, assuming that your Delta 9 still remains under 0.3. So that would be one method by which we can kind of make this work. but it's going to require a lot of talk, a lot of research, and a lot of work from people like you to really get this industry going. This is one of the major issues. I'll pass it off to my partner.
Well, thanks, Tim. And I don't have a lot to add about that, except to point out that the FDA and the USDA is not the DEA. And so where for years we've been worried about our clients, going to prison over this, we're not as worried about that now. But this has a huge, if you think about cannabis as an agricultural commodity, as we're all going to have to start thinking about cannabis as an agricultural commodity, whether it's for hemp and CBD or when we get to adult use, if you're contracted with somebody to purchase your crop, and now your crop is at 0.4 or 0.5, or it's at 1%, there's an economic, the crop loses its value. It can't be sold. It can't be moved in interstate commerce. So it's a contract violation. It's a breach of contract. So there's huge economic impact to the industry, even though we're not necessarily talking about people getting arrested and going to jail. In terms of the criminal law, you have hemp farm, you have people, if your crop gets slightly over 0.3, or they're going to change the calculation to total theoretical THC, and everybody's crop now is over 0.3. Those weren't intentional violations of the criminal statutes. You weren't intentionally trying to grow marijuana, which is still a controlled substance. The farmer negligently had his crop exceed the limits by a little bit. So I think, in Vermont, the rules are going to look at that and make an allowance for a negligent exceeding the levels negligently, and make a distinction between that and somebody who's just ignoring the rules entirely and out there growing a crop that is undoubtedly marijuana with theoretical THC of 25 or 30 or 35%. So this is an issue for the industry, and the patchwork of rules and regulations across the country are an issue for the industry right now. But we're fortunate, and just to bring it home to Vermont a little bit, we're fortunate to be in Vermont, and a state that has taken a very supportive approach towards the hemp industry and the CBD industry, and a state that has encouraged people to not only to grow hemp, and to work with people about calculating their THC levels and proposing a margin of up to 1%. But also encouraging people to make products containing CBD, and to make food products containing CBD, and to make topical products containing CBD, and to proudly market those as Vermont-made CBD products. And it's our belief at Vermont Cannabis Solutions that this approach that Vermont is taking right now is really going to give Vermont a chance to have a foot up on the competition. In Massachusetts right now, you cannot sell CBD edibles. In Vermont, we can. Our industry is learning important lessons and developing strategies and business strategies that's going to give us an advantage, because I think ultimately, with this being driven by a large part by Kentucky's Senator Mitch McConnell, who was one of the leading advocates in getting the hemp provisions in the 2018 Farm Bill, he doesn't want to plant all that hemp in Kentucky and then tell people that they can't make CBD products with it. There is, at the moment, no real other market for those hemp products. We should talk about that also, because there's a ton of other potential markets for hemp. Another really exciting part of the industry, kind of a different topic, but we should be talking about hemp being used to make plastic, and being used to make hempcrete, and being used to make paper and fiber and textiles. But at the moment, there's no infrastructure, domestic infrastructure, to support those other uses of the hemp plant. So all those thousands of acres that are being planted all over the country are being grown for CBD right now. And for the USDA and the FDA to shut down the industry when it's in its infancy, I don't think anybody wants that, in particular the Republican senator from Kentucky, who's got the chance to influence things. So yeah, those are my comments. There's a million other issues. As Tim said, we'd love to field your questions, but those are the comments I have for right now. I'll pass it on to Rod.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So our last speaker is Rye Matthews. Rye is a co-founder and chief technology officer for Northeast Hemp Commodities, which is a collaborative group of farmers, scientists, engineers, marketers, and business people coming together to form a team focused on breeding, growing, and processing the most productive hemp strains in the world. Rye has a BS from UVM with a concentration in ecological design, and grew up on an organic farm in Vermont and married an organic dairy farmer. He's also a consultant with the Vermont Hemp Company, which is a research and development firm based in Jericho, Vermont. Thank you.
No, it's just for it. It's okay.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be here. This is a really complicated and important topic. I think it has a huge amount of potential, but it's very complex. We're full of hypocrisy in the regulations and the way things have kind of developed. So there's a lot to sort through. So these guys provided a lot of context. I'm going to provide a little more context. So like all of these guys have said, so 0.3% delta-9 THC is the defining line. All hemp is cannabis. Hemp, is just cannabis with less than 0.3%. Anything over that is considered marijuana. Now that 0.3% delta-9 THC, that number came from a study in the 70s in Canada where some researchers were looking at leaf material, and they're trying to decide or determine where's kind of the dividing line between hemp and marijuana. And they kept finding this 0.3 number as sort of a dividing point, but it had absolutely nothing to do with human consumption of material that was either above or below that 0.3% number. They're just strictly looking at the biology of the plant in the leaf material, not the developed flower material, which is where cannabinoid concentrations are highest. So, it's a flawed definition from the very beginning. It was taken from old research and applied, we'll get to it. So delta-9 THC, as Tim mentioned, that's the only intoxicating compound in cannabis. There's over 100 other cannabinoids. There's over 400 different terpenes and flavonoids. They're not intoxicating. They might have some psychoactive properties, meaning that they interact with your brain. That does not mean they're intoxicating. So when Rusty was talking about the FDA policy that CBD is a drug, what that refers to is that there is one prescription drug that has been registered with CBD as the active ingredient, and that's called Epidiolex, produced by a company, GW Pharmaceuticals. That, it's interesting because the federal government has patents on CBD. These were filed in 1997. CBD as a neural protectant, protecting brain cells. The FDA policy, because this drug has been approved and CBD is an active ingredient, their policy is that it can't be a food or dietary supplement unless there was evidence that it was a food or dietary ingredient in the past, which there's tons of evidence that CBD has been in cannabis extracts since, millennia. People have been making cannabis extracts. They just didn't know what CBD was. So even before this drug was created, the federal government had already approved, had patented CBD as a protectant, generally regarded as safe. And the FDA is kind of refusing to recognize that. So it's a strange situation, but moving forward, generally, I want to touch on Vermont's laws because a lot of people are confused, even within the hemp industry, about Vermont's laws. On the marijuana side, you're allowed to have, the home grow, 2 plants at home, or you can get marijuana through medical dispensaries or medically registered caregivers. There's no legal tax and regulate market for high THC cannabis or marijuana. In contrast, hemp cultivation has a tiered permit structure through the Agency of Ag. You can grow as much hemp as you can afford to grow at any scale. And it's a strange dichotomy because these hemp plants, predominantly for CBD, they look exactly like marijuana. I can't even tell the difference in my own backyard between my hemp plants and my home grow plants without knowing what they are ahead of time and getting some testing done afterwards. So, like I said, all cannabis can produce different cannabinoids, but hemp, basically when this definition came through of the 0.3%, all of these breeders that were producing medical marijuana, they looked at the laws and they saw that, okay, any cannabis, as long as the THC is low, anything else is fair game. So we have medical varieties that had high CBD, high CBG, other compounds. They realized, we can grow these as hemp if we breed the THC as low as possible. So now we're opening up new doors. This is where the CBD boom came from, and it was developed in the US. These are new hemp varieties. These are not the old landrace hemp varieties from Asia and Europe and everywhere else. I mean, people are pulling genetics from all over the place, but these high CBD, high CBG genetics were developed in the US, first in the medical scene, and then under these hemp rules over the last 5 years. So many people know cannabis it's a jack of all trades. The seeds are extremely nutritious. It's almost a perfect nutrition for humans. The protein is 90% digestible based on its globular structure, which matches up with our blood cells. It also has the ideal ratio of omega fatty acids, and it's a complete protein, meaning it contains all 23 amino acids. Hemp, bast, and herd fibers also have thousands of uses historically. We can, rope, everything, we wouldn't have been able to sail to this continent without hemp sails, rigging, cots, the clothing that the sailors were wearing, the fishing nets they're using, so many things that this has been ingrained in human culture for thousands of years. And it's only been the past 80 years of prohibition that we've forgotten a lot of this. Meanwhile, other parts of the world have continued developing their hemp technology, integrating hemp into their societies. Hemp is still a major food source in China and in India. Future uses of hemp plastic, like Tim was saying, and Andrew, there's huge potential in bioplastics, medical fabrics, based on the fiber has antibacterial, antimicrobial properties, just the structure of the fiber itself. Energy production through ethanol, you can debate the environmentalism of that, but natural graphene, something I'm just going to touch on, you can research that yourself, but there's huge, huge potential here in more of a diverse hemp economy than just what cannabinoids have potential for. Sorry. I covered most of this. So, the traditional type of hemp farming with the grain and fiber varieties, which has been for the production in Canada for the past 25 years, has been strictly limited to grain and fiber production, not cannabinoid production. It's very different variety, type of genetics. It's a different farming method where it's more like corn and other grains. They're direct seeding right into the field, letting it grow, very dense population, over 200,000 plants per acre. And then they're coming back and at the end of the year, combining the grain, harvesting the fiber like straw. And it's very different compared to the cannabinoid production for flower. That flower is only produced by female plants. And you want female plants to not get pollinated, because if they do, that flower then starts producing seed that you don't really want. It doesn't contain the cannabinoids. So the CBD production, we're talking about only about 1,000 plants per acre, grown very spaced out. It's very labor and financially intensive to nurture these plants for these high-end resins. There's a little bit of a myth out there that hemp is benign or good for the environment. It really depends on how you're farming it. It's just like anything else. But in order to get a large yielding crop, you need a lot of water, you need nutrient inputs. In order to do this in an environmentally responsible manner and have reliable, consistent production, you need crop rotations and using other cover crops to build content when you're not growing hemp on that land. We are seeing a lot of farmers, a lot of the people that hemp is appealing to, they already had this kind of regenerative outlook, or those things kind of line up, but then they want to grow a huge amount of hemp, and all of a sudden they're in conflict because that doesn't really line up with regenerative practices. And the most reliable way to grow it right now is in plasticulture, which is definitely not environmentally sustainable. That's a big challenge we face, and people are constantly experimenting, and we are seeing some good solutions, some more sustainable growing practices with cover cropping and small amount of cultivation, trying to get away from the plastic culture. There's also sustainable or regenerative types of plastic or other compostable materials to be used instead of petroleum products. Water quality is a huge one, because hemp really does, if you want to get large yields, you need a lot of water. So we all of a sudden have people pumping hundreds of gallons a minute out of small streams that are flowing past the border of their property. That is not sustainable. We need to look at earthworks and really investing in shaping the landscape of your farm to support this over time with ponds, buffer systems, just understanding, kind of permaculture water use practices. So there are definitely ways to grow hemp more sustainably or less sustainably. Let's see. So, like I said before, we've missed out on 80 years of research and development in the cannabis and hemp industry, and we have a lot of catching up to do compared to other places like Russia and China, where they continued to grow hemp and to develop equipment to work with hemp and to farm hemp. But we have this new advantage of these new cannabinoid genetics that nobody else in the world is really working this opportunity. But the mentality behind prohibition continues to persist and be a constant challenge for us. A lot of people struggle with embracing kind of plant-based culture. But the discovery of the endocannabinoid system didn't even happen until the early 1990s. And this is one of the most important physiological systems we have in our bodies. It's in all mammals, and it's still barely touched on in medical schools. But this is a system that is primarily focused on maintaining and modulating homeostasis in humans and other mammals. It's a crucial system of neurotransmitters and receptors throughout our body that we have very minimal understanding of right now. But it's named after cannabis because we discovered this system through researching cannabis and why does cannabis affect humans the way that it does. And we realized, well, we have this whole system of endocannabinoids. Our body produces its own cannabinoids already. So I want to use that as a lens to just look at how researching plants can open so many doors that we have not opened yet. We have a huge amount of potential ahead of us, diving deeper into not just cannabis, but all of these other plants that we take for granted. And really trying to use that to create a more diverse farm ecosystem. Yeah, hemp has a huge possibility, but like I said earlier in the dairy section, if you're relying on just one crop or commodity for your whole business and lifestyle, you're walking a really dangerous line. And the more we can diversify into all different types of crop production and long-term fruit and nut crops mixed with livestock, and diversify our approach, yeah, it's hard to find that efficiency of scale if you're doing tons of little things. But if you partner up with lots of other people who are doing the same thing, then you can find that efficiency of scale through collaborative, cooperation. There are some really crucial political reforms that are holding us back. Major one is that federally, Delta-9 THC is a controlled substance, Schedule 1. Schedule 1 says that there's no recognized medical use. That's obviously a joke because the majority of states have medical marijuana programs in place and have for a decade now. Similarly, Vermont has Delta-9 THC as a Schedule 1 controlled substance and a medical marijuana program, completely at conflict with each other. Most of the people who were disproportionately affected by cannabis prohibition and the war on drugs have little access or right to take part in this new U.S. cannabis economy. Many of them are still in jail or have criminal records, that's a crime in itself. These things need to be rectified. On top of that, we have the federal work visa green card programs that are extremely limiting. And this is another conversation that could have come up in the dairy segment. But all these local farms, the vast majority of them rely on migrant, undocumented labor. And we just need to open up to the fact that we depend on these people, and we should make a legal process for them to be here on work programs, or work towards citizenship if that's what they're looking to do. We depend, our economy severely depends on these migrant workers. In addition to that, what John was talking about earlier is the carbon aspect of this, which we can use carbon as a tool to drive change. We hear a lot of talk about a carbon tax, and it's a negative thing in people's minds. But if we were regulating things properly, carbon, could also be a moneymaker for people, for landowners, for farmers, for people with timber lots who have responsible, long-term practices in place to sequester carbon. Now, this goes back to, so Jack kind of talking about the conflict between capitalism and socialism. In reality, we're in a mixed market economy as it is. We have a huge number of socialist programs. When you look at the public education and police and fire department and so many other things. And we need to understand we can't just go ever onward with constant growth in an unsustainable way. And if we look at the example of nature and our own bodies, we are constantly growing in a sustainable way through change. Our bodies are constantly adapting, replacing it. Your cells replace themselves every 7 years. You don't look that different, but you've replaced 200 pounds of material, and that drives growth in a sustainable way, sustainable fashion of, any change is growth and is creating growth for other folks. We just have to see that it's being passed around and focus on that cyclical growth, which is a more long-term strategy than just endless growth upward or in one direction. Just have some pictures. Oop, go back one. Just to kind of focus on the difference between different types of hemp crops. So the one in the top right, that's a fiber crop. You can see there are thousands of plants just in that picture, all closely grown together, getting very long, tall, straight stalk, very long fiber molecules, and it's a completely different material than these other pictures, which are the CBD crops. I just wanted to show that it can be done without plastic culture. It can be done with cover crops and mixing other crops into your production. But even still, I mean, those are all basically pictures of close to a monoculture, which is a challenge to get away from. I mean, if you're a commercial farm producer, it's most efficient to focus on one thing in each field, but there are people that are proving that you can grow on a commercial scale with integrated crops or windrows of different crops. And this last one, we all talked about THCA, Delta 9. It's easier if I can point it out here. This is tested raw material. The Delta 9 is very low. That's to be expected. THCA, so this is, all the cannabinoids are in acid form. Thank you. The cannabinoids are in acid form. What did I do? Anyway, the cannabinoids are in acid form when they're in the plant, and then they, when you decarb them, they're going into an activated form. Now, those acid compounds also have properties that interact with our endocannabinoid system. We need a lot more research on all of these cannabinoids and how they interact with our endocannabinoid system. Like I said, the Delta 9, the 0.3% never had anything to do with how that affects people. Part of why Phil Scott didn't want to allow the recreational program to go forward, we had no way to determine intoxication. And that's because there's been hardly any, we haven't allowed any federal research because of this prohibition into what's an intoxicating amount of THC and is the same amount intoxicating for each person depending on your use of THC in the past, your specific body chemistry, and many other factors. But this is just a test result that shows these are the major cannabinoids in hemp that we're testing for. So this is a high CBD plant, but it shows up as CBDA as the raw form. And they're using a formula to show you what that would be when it's converted and what the THC would be. Now these two tests are from the same plant, taken at the same time, and I have one that the total THC after conversion came out to 0.5, and the other one came out to 0.1. That one is compliant, and this one's not. Now, the law you're supposed to be testing based on the dry weight content, 0% moisture. Every lab has a completely different program of how they test this material, whether they test it at the moisture content they came in on, whether they dry it out completely, whether they use equipment to try to figure out what it would be dry. There's no standard at all yet for seeing what's a dry material to be tested at, and that makes a huge difference too. If you have 20% moisture in your sample, you're not going to get an accurate number on what the dry content of THC is. Vermont is proposing regulating based on the ratio of CBD to THC in the plant, and that's a genetic determined ratio that even if your plant is stressed out by drought or it goes a little too long because of conditions and the THC goes up a little too high, if you could prove to the state that that ratio is over 20-1 CBD to THC, that's a hemp dominant variety, that's a much more sane way to regulate this. But where we are now, it's just all over the board. And I could go on for a long time, but I'd probably open it up for questions instead.
Hi, we heard earlier about concerns about overproduction in the dairy industry, and I was wondering if you have any of the same concerns arising in the hemp industry. I don't have a specific source, but I feel like I've heard concerns about growers being able to sell hemp that they're currently producing, as well as the shutdown of a production facility or processing facility over in Middlebury.
Yeah, it's a great question. We've seen this year a huge increase in the number of acres of hemp planted in Vermont compared to last year. I think that's true for a lot of states all over the country. So there will be a huge increase in supply, and we're seeing that now as we reach harvest time. We're seeing what the yield is, and there's not enough processing capacity in Vermont for the amount of hemp that's been grown. So that is a bottleneck in the system, at least for this year. There are additional processors that are coming into the state. There are plans for some big processing facilities, but they're not up and running yet. So with regard to overproduction, we've seen a huge increase in production. We've seen a huge increase in demand. So it's a unique situation where sort of the supply is going up and the demand is also going up. How will that affect prices? That's another big uncertainty in the industry. Right now, we try to keep a good idea of what the price is for smokable flower, for biomass. You're going to be getting a higher price depending on the CBD content of your crop. And we've seen certainly a leveling off of price and maybe a decrease from some of the crazy numbers that people were talking about last year. But still, for properly grown and properly cured flower, you're still seeing a nice return on investment. And other people who are selling biomass, are having to spend less effort harvesting, trimming, curing. But the crop that they get then is of a less value. So, but the question as to overproduction, I don't think we've reached that level yet. When you talk about companies that are just awaiting these FDA guidelines, big companies, Walgreens and CVS, and somebody mentioned Carl's Jr., Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola apparently has plans in the works for a CBD beverage. It's going to be released nationwide as soon as they feel that the risk is low enough for them to do that. So when we start seeing these kind of big companies getting into CBD, obviously there's going to be a huge demand for quality CBD, and I think that's Vermont's place in this, is really focusing on the craft quality, the craft industry, as we do with cheese and some other things. So.
And if I could talk to the closure of the Victory hemp plant in Middlebury, which was talked about, that plant actually extracted hemp seeds, not flower for CBD or any other cannabinoids. And the problem they were having was basically that there wasn't enough hemp seed in Vermont. And not a lot of growers are growing for seed. A lot of growers are growing for that CBD flower. You grow very differently for seed.
Can I speak to
Yeah,
that
of course.
directly?
Go right ahead. Right.
So I was involved in recruiting Victory Hemp Foods to move into that facility, and we did grow for seed through some research programs. This was in 2016. And we tried to convince more farmers to grow for seed, as it was a more stable and a much lower, upfront cost on their end. But when the CBD boom hit and neighbors heard what the guy down the road was making on CBD, nobody wanted to grow the grain because you can't grow them right next to each other. Those crops for seed need to get pollinated to get to grow seed. And the crops for flower, you want to avoid pollination at all costs. So interestingly, Victory Hemp Foods they're based out of Kentucky. They're building a very large facility down there, so it wasn't the end of the world for them to move all that equipment back to Kentucky. My company is actually taking over that facility. We are building that out for cannabinoid processing in Middlebury. And we definitely see that not all the links to the chain are in place right now. So there's a huge, we're at the very beginning of like large-scale national or global market saturation for CBD products. But we do have a little bit of oversaturation right now in the raw material supply because the processors are trying to expand. We're trying to get loan for CBD processing equipment on a large scale. That's very challenging right now when we don't have, we have people talking about potentially wanting really large amounts of CBD for large retail brands, but it's not there yet. We need more clarity on the federal level or even just on the state level. We have the ag policy that we're allowed to sell it as food, but it's not written law. It's not protecting us. We're going way out on a limb, and we're regularly, because there is a shortage of processors in Vermont, we regularly ship truckloads of hemp material to other states, and these are multi-million-dollar truckloads. We're putting the material and the truck drivers at risk transporting. Now, Rusty got into this a little bit, but the 2018 Farm Bill did say that hemp is a commodity now if you can prove that it's hemp. It didn't clarify whether you could sell it as a food or a supplement or whatever else. But if we're just shipping hemp material to another processor, technically, as long as we can prove it's hemp, we legally should be allowed to ship it through any state. There are some states that aren't real happy about that, but that's just, the fight we're having right now.
Yeah, I mean, you can't look at traditional supply and demand metrics when it comes to hemp because of the external factors. We are seeing just, as Rai said, the 2018 Farm Bill specifically states that interstate transport is okay, yet we're seeing shipments stopped in Idaho, in Oklahoma, just recently in South Carolina with a driver being charged with drug trafficking. When one of the things we'll do for our clients, we just recently had about a 4,000-pound shipment from Vermont going down to North Carolina. We set up cannabis law attorneys in every single state that transport was going through. We had a list for the driver, so when they were in New York, if they had a problem, they had somebody they could call 24/7. When they crossed into Jersey, they had a number they could call. That's the type of steps that we're taking. So when you look at supply and demand with general agricultural commodities, hemp really does stand alone because of those external factors. It's very difficult to try to gauge. But with normalization, with standardization, hopefully with the USDA rules coming down, with pilot programs being adopted into permanent programs, we're going to see some amount of stabilization, which will allow us to kind of gauge that whole supply-demand equation a little better.
I have the mic now, I guess. First, working for a Democrat from Vermont, who, along with a Republican from Kentucky, pushed in both the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bill to legalize hemp. I guess I take some responsibility on his behalf for complicating everybody's lives so much. We got some things to work through. I think that, Rye gets at it as far as maybe we just need to cut that knot as far as being a controlled substance. I think the USDA will get there. My question is related to the FDA, and where do you feel the FDA should land? There's definitely going to be something come from the FDA on this at some point. And I've had Vermont hemp producers tell me that CBD will cure hepatitis C. I mean, there are claims being made. There's a lot of benefits. So where do we end up with the FDA on this, ideally?
So FDA, when I said they're not enforcing it, they are enforcing some things. And that is if people are making ridiculous health claims. So there are health claims out there. You can literally Google CBD and then insert medical malady, and there will be somebody out there that says it cures it. The only one I was not able to find was explosive diarrhea, but that's because CBD actually causes, that's one of the side effects of it. But I mean, you're talking Alzheimer's, cancer, and them and the FTC have cracked down on people making those kind of claims. But as far as what they're going to allow, I mean, we're hearing things like maybe they'll allow it, but it'll be in very low dosage, like subtherapeutic dosages. But I mean, right now, they're wanting to gather as much evidence as they can and then come forward. Because when Epidiolex was approved, one of the things when you submit a new drug for approval is you have to give, well, these are potential side effects. But, well, how much of this causes these particular side effects? FDA is listed like diarrhea is one of them. I think they said there's potential liver complications if you take too much, but well, how much is too much? And that's the FDA position is when it comes to drugs, they are very, very cautious. So food and drugs, they treat them very differently. So once they said it was a drug, that changed the dynamic for them as far as regulatory front went.
That's true. I mean, Tim and I, a couple weeks ago, were down in New York at the Cannabis Law Institute, which was a meeting of cannabis attorneys from all over the country. And this FDA, what is the FDA likely to do? Obviously, was a huge topic of discussion for just about every panel that we listened to. And sort of I've heard a lot of thought. There's sort of an opinion, and the fundamental problem, as has been pointed out, is that CBD has been approved as a drug, and drugs can't go in food. That's the rule, and yet there's huge pressure from the industry to allow some form of CBD to go into food and dietary supplements. So what people are predicting, and what I think is probably a likely approach for the FDA to take, is that it's been referred to as like swim lanes. So different products will have different swim lanes for regulatory approval. So they're not going to say to GW Pharma that all the money that they spent on those human clinical trials to have Epidiolex approved as a drug, that too bad for you, now everybody's going to be selling it at the gas station. That's not a political and an economic reality. For the pharmaceutical companies are going to get their share of the CBD industry. But and we were talking about higher dosages that cause side effects and so forth. I think that's right. A product that's 70, 80, 90% CBD that's made from isolate, that's water soluble. That if you see CBD isolate, it looks like a white powder, right? That looks like a drug. That looks like something that should be maybe regulated as a drug. So maybe the pharmaceutical companies you're going to need a prescription to buy a CBD that's 70, 80% CBD in a water-soluble form. That could be a nasal spray. It could be just about anything when you're talking about isolate. A product that would be allowed into food would be a much lower percentage of CBD. People are talking about maybe something that is a full spectrum, a whole plant product that's pressed or distilled with other aspects. In other words, not adding additional CBD, but that CBD was somehow extracted from the plant in a whole plant type of way. That's going to lead you with 10 or 12% CBD. That could go into a food or to a dietary supplement. A third set of regulations for topical products, where there's much less, there's still a concern about being safe and effective, but there's much less concern about adverse health effects with topical products. A lot of the products now that are being marketed as topicals really are just methods of ingesting a transdermal way to ingest CBD. So to be a truly topical product, you have to explain why you have CBD in your product for health and beauty reasons, and not because you're trying to ease the pain that's in your muscle. So topicals have their own issues, but probably an easier path to regulatory approval than products that are intended for human ingestion. And then we have pet products, which would also be regulated by the FDA. And again, an easier path to regulatory approval for pet products, because although I'm sure there's concern about the safety and effectiveness of drugs for pets, doesn't rise to the same level as stuff for human consumption. And then we have those 4 swim lanes for CBD products, and which leaves the huge question of smokable flower, smokable CBD flower, which has got potential problems with being hot, depending on the method that we talked about earlier for calculating theoretical THC. But smokable flower has become a real important part of Vermont's industry anyway. And what is the FDA going to say about smokable hemp flower? And because, you know, they have a whole lot to say about tobacco. But this is not tobacco, but it's a smokable product. So, you know, exactly what they're going to say about each of these things, we anxiously await. But I think the idea that there's going to be a division in the regulations depending on your product makes a lot of sense. And so what we're advising people is try to figure out which of these categories your product is most similar to. If it's a cookie with CBD in it, that's a food. If it's a tincture with CBD in it, that's a food. If it's a topical, you know, it better make your hair shiny and not be used to ease the pain in your fingers. So that kind of thing. But you got to make an analogy between the product you're making and some product that's already out there being regulated to try to anticipate what the FDA is going to say.
Can I piggyback on that quickly? I think the distinction between isolate and a spectrum product is huge. The Epidiolex drug is from CBD isolate, and that's what was approved as a drug. A full spectrum product, you know, there's infinite differences in one full spectrum to another full spectrum product, depending on the plants that it came from and the processes used to extract that. We are extracting a drug in this room as we speak. It's the caffeine in those coffee pots over there right now. So we've tackled this before. Caffeine, you know, there's many other natural plant compounds that are also drugs. They're present in our food, they're present in supplements, and they're present in prescription drugs. You look at capsaicin and methanol, menthol. But caffeine is a great example where it's naturally present in a food that we consume every day. It's the largest, you know, drug consumption in the world is caffeine. It's also extracted and added to supplements, regulated by the dose, and it's also a component in many prescription drugs. And there's no reason that we can't figure this out. It's just taking the FDA a very long time because they, you know, there was a ban on federal research for, you know, decades and decades and decades, and the very little bit of research that we did have, people didn't really pick up and run with it in the U.S. because they were restricted to, you know, so we have a lot of catching up to do.
So please join me in thanking all our panelists. And I believe that lunch is behind those screens. Is that right? Okay. Thank you.